I'm not particularly in favour of quarter or whatever of the population become unemployed and going back to the Depression. I really don't think that's a very sensible thing to do. And I think the policymakers ought to be a bit more intelligent, frankly. And there is a perfectly viable solution which I put forward, which is around you have to have a difficult conversation with people about retraining and about raising pension age.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey there. Welcome to The New Rules with Alan Pentz, where we help you navigate today's chaos with precision. Your host, Alan Pentz, has 25 years of experience working in business and government, and he knows how the old rules have fallen apart. Each episode, we'll explore how to thrive in this new landscape by mastering the new rules while everyone else is still figuring them out. Let's dive in.
Well, today on the podcast, we have a very special guest, Paul Hodges. He is the chairman of New Normal, and he and his group have just released a report called the PH Report, which is a little bit of a play on words. So, Paul, welcome to the podcast, and tell us a little bit about the report.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. Yes. So we started the report exactly 10 years ago, in fact, due to sort of questions from our audience who are mainly investors on the one hand and corporates on the other. And they said, look, when you do the project with us, we love it, but then we don't see you for a while because we don't have projects all the time. Could you do a monthly report? So we produced what we call this, with this great play on words. It was our Hong Kong Dutchman who came up with it, the PH Report, which is the litmus test on the world economy. And we've been talking about the importance of things like geopolitics for some time. And our aim in life is that, as it says, this is the litmus test for the world economy. And so we're talking about the things that will actually drive investment decisions. We're interested, obviously, but we're not talking about the things that are going to move the market up down this afternoon. That's not what we're trying to do.
Exactly. So, well, give us some ideas. Some of the key ideas are around the demographic changes going on in the world. So kind of take us through that thinking.
Perhaps I can give you an example. So going back a while now, when you were a babe in arms, Alan, in 2005, 2006.
Seems hard to believe.
Indeed, yes. And I had hair. We began to get very worried about the potential for a major financial crisis. And so we were writing in the Financial Times and other papers, look, there is going to be this massive financial crisis caused by what's going on in housing and autos. And of course, what everybody says, you really don't understand, actually, everything comes started. Bernanke was a brilliant man, he got all this and so on. You're all pretty wrong. And then, of course, it all happened. And as a result of that, a number of people, including a publisher, came to us and said, hey, you were one of the few people. In fact, the Financial Times, funnily enough, in November of 2008, wrote a piece saying, Queen of England has asked, why did nobody warn me of this? And actually, when we go back through the files, 5 did. Clearly, PIMCO was one of the great leaders, had did a lot of work in that area, but they kindly named us as well, which was very nice. So we had a number of investors saying, hey, this is quite interesting. And we had a publisher who was interested. So we ended up publishing a book called Boom, Gloom and the New Normal, how the aging of the baby boomers changing demand patterns again. And the idea was, this upsets all the monetarists at low end, but that's part of our job. If you go back after the war, we had a baby boom. In the States, for first 18 years, 46 to 64, we had a 52% increase in the number of babies being born compared to the previous 18 years. Similarly, if you take the G7, 7 wealthiest countries in the world, which at the time were half of the world economy, so they mattered, there was a major overall increase in numbers. So if you're not a sort of mainstream central bank economist who believes that it's all about monetarism, and actually if you read Friedman didn't just say, oh, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary threat. He went on and he made a few other points as well, which people completely forget. And the other point is demand and supply are all about people. So if you have a 52% increase in demand over a sustained period, and if that happens after a major war, now, okay, apart from Pearl Harbor, the States didn't actually get bombed itself, but Europe did, most of Europe, both sides got bombed, and the States stopped making refrigerators and cookers and started making tanks and airplanes. So you have this massive increase in demand, and because of the babies, and you also have a reduction in normal supply. Well, inevitably you get inflation. Well, this is just obvious. You've got far more demand than supply. And so, and so we saw what happened. But after a while, of course, these babies grow up. And by 1983, half of the G7 baby boomers are now in what we call the wealth creator period. If you look at the BIS data, Bureau of Labour Studies data, or any of the central bank data, or what you see is that for the age under 24, spending is pretty low. It comes from your parents, it comes from your maybe apprentice, your college grants, whatever it is like that. When you get to be 25, you can start to earn real money. You may well settle down. You may well have a family. You may well buy a house. You may well buy a car. All of these things you're buying for the first time. And so inevitably, therefore, you've got to change, because these people were not only going out and creating demand now, they were also creating supply. And so by the time you get to the early 1990s, you've actually got a perfect balance where you've got large numbers, really large numbers of people going into the workforce, moving up in their careers, making more money, and so on. So you've got a balance between demand and supply. In 1999, as you'll recall, President Clinton had a balanced budget. Can you imagine a balanced budget today? That's what you had, because it had all worked its way back. Inflation had come down because you had all this extra supply, and so on. And then the major change, and this is what has really caught the central banks out, is that people no longer die as they did after the war at pension age. When I started work, our office manager, I work for one of the biggest companies in the UK, one of the biggest companies in the world, in fact. Our office manager took us for a drink on our first week, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you graduates are really lucky because you're working for ICI and you'll get to retirement age, and at ICI, you'll retire at 62 rather than 66. And so therefore, you will actually have another 4 years on the golf course before you die." And this was how it was. But of course, he was out of date even then. And today we have 15 extra years of life, which is very good news if you're me. But the issue with this is that now the main source of population growth in the world, in the G7, in the States, is not babies anymore. It's people in what we call the perennials, 55 plus. And the thing about the perennials is we're extremely nice people. Take it from me, we're very nice people, but we have very little cause for demand. I was mentioning before we started, we moved to Portugal 5 years ago. Now, if you compare, in 1985, I moved to the States with work. I set up an oil trading business in Houston, Texas. And we had one small boy who was a year old. We had another, so we have a Texan in the family. And we took out one container load. And when we went back, we took 2 container loads because the kids grew and they moved on and so on. Now, when we moved out, my wife and I moved out to Portugal 5 years ago, we brought 1 container load. And after a while, my wife said, "I think we really do need a new sofa." And I, as a typical husband, said, "Well, I think the sofa's fine, actually." But in the end, of course, we got the new sofa. But the point is, we are now, the perennials are a replacement society. So you can't get growth. And then the final point, Alan, of all of this, which is absolutely critical for where we are today, and the US deficit and all, and the debt mountain and so on and so forth around the world, the critical point is you can't have growth because the main source of your population growth is people like myself, and we don't have much demand. We may have a bit of services and so on. So all of this stimulus that's been done on the basis that if we only do enough stimulus, we will somehow generate growth, that would have been true in the 1980s, but it isn't true today. And that's why we're in the mess that we're in, and it will get worse, unfortunately.
Excellent. So we just went talking through the spending. Largely what you're talking about when you talk about monetarists is like, it's the money supply and interest rate, sort of a Milton Friedman, that sort of not a kind of Keynesian demand-driven view of the world, right? And so what you're saying is like, these generational, as a generation ages, gets to know its prime spending years, that's what really drives an economy. And we just got through, one of the largest generations ever. And now we're moving into a place where there's a lot of what you call the perennials who they are still adding to the economy, but not at kind of level that someone who's in their prime spending years with kids, and, as you mentioned in Houston. So a couple of things. How do you count for, like, say, the millennial generation in the US? So as I understand it, the US is really the only global economy that has a significant portion of people in their 30s, I guess, right now. Like, I guess it's like 30s to 40s right now. Is that changing? Is that maybe one of the reasons the US economy is doing better comparatively to other economies in the world? Or how do you see that?
I don't think, Alan, that it's really the US is that different. What you've got in the States is a very high proportion, nearly a third of the population are now Hispanics. So again, we don't mess around with the data. We just take whatever the government tells us and that's it. But if you look at it, essentially now in the States, you've got two different populations. You've got the white Haitian population, which is very similar in demographic characteristics in terms of median age and income to Europe, very similar indeed. And you have a much poorer, much younger Hispanic and Black community, as they're just using the BLS definitions there. And so this is why the US looks much better, because a lot of people who don't bother to go down into that detail say, oh, look, the US, we're much younger, we're much better. Well, yes, you are overall, but if you take it overall, you're also much poorer. And so the question, I think, which of course is very topical today, is older populations, as you see in the States, as you see in Japan, it's a great trailing, as you see in China, as you see in Europe, older populations don't like immigrants for all sorts of reasons. When they were younger, everybody was happy. When I was in Houston, as I say, in the 80s, I never heard a word said about what we used to call the wetbacks. Everybody loved the Hispanics. That's not the same today for all sorts of reasons, which we don't need to go into. So you've got this really significant paradigm shift. And when you look at why has the States done very well, because it's got a ridiculous amount of borrowing. If you keep giving me free money as much as I like, well, I'm going to take it. If I'm a company, for example, and I run major businesses, as you know, major global businesses, major businesses in the States. If you say to me, well, we're going to give you free money and as much as you like, and my board says, well, actually, if we look at demand for our products or services, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for us to expand. And then somebody will say, well, yes, but if we don't expand and our competitor X expands, we will lose market share. And overall, investors will penalize us for that. So we better expand. Equally, if you go and talk to individuals and they're being offered 0% mortgages, and then from that they can buy cars and they can buy things, then again, someone in the family will say, but are you sure we can repay this? If you say, but the Fed has promised that interest rates will always be 0%, so what's the risk? So in other words, what I'm saying is that the real mistake that the central banks have made, and this is, we're going to pay back in that time for it now. In the past, I've said, oh, look, this is going to be a problem. Now I've moved. Now I'm saying, this is the when moment. This is when it gets really difficult. The problem we now have is that we've got all this debt. The central banks have interfered with the markets for very long, but they can't do it anymore. And so now it's no coincidence at all. Jay Powell starting to reduce interest rates in September. He's reduced them by 1%. The benchmark 10-year rate has gone up 1%. Now, as far as I know, that's never happened before. And what that tells you is that some investors, the good old bond vigilantes that we used to have in gold all the time, are now saying, with Trump, will he default? The States has defaulted 4 times in the past. Isn't it going to be easier for Trump to say, no, we're going to make America great again. We're not going to pay this debt. And I think that's the main reason why interest rates are rising. And if that is right, you're in a very serious position.
Right. And by default, do you mean sort of like the soft default of inflating?
I don't know. I'm saying we won't default.
You're saying hard default?
Yeah, hard default. I mean, the States has done this 4 times.
Right. Not in the modern era, I guess.
Well, the Hill had a useful summary of it, which we noted in the last report. It goes back to the it's only 50 or 60 years ago, the last one.
So your take is, hey, look, you guys have been juicing the economy through, well, I guess before the pandemic, it was really some kind of quantitative easing or, the central bank buying bonds. And you've been, obviously during the pandemic, a lot of direct stimulus, at least in the United States, and then support to business, and then a lot of infrastructure and other type spending in the IRA and things. So the economy has been propped up, essentially, in your view, by government stimulus. And without that, it wouldn't be growing. Is that sort of the thing?
Well, the states and China, sorry to interrupt, states and China did two forms of stimulus. China did more, and China did it mainly, they did subprime on steroids. And they got exactly the same result as subprime got up to 2008. They got a massive increase in house prices. The states only got up to average prices of 12 times earnings. China got to 45 times earnings in the tier 1 cities. China became the largest auto market in the world. It was 500,000 cars a month. It went up to 2 million cars a month because people did exactly the same. Well, since 2021, for the last 3.5 years, that market has gone fut. So we know how these stories end, and that's where the States is going to end today.
Yeah. And I was seeing something the other day talking about, everyone's looking for more stimulus from China to get the economy going. And someone I saw, I can't remember who it was pointing out, like, they already are stimulating a crazy rate, and their deficit is, I don't know, close to ours, 6 or 7, maybe higher. And so, like, what they're saying is you need to, not that you need to stimulate, you need to stimulate more, right? You're already stimulating. And that, so basically, once you withdraw that stimulus, the economy would stop growing completely.
If you could create a perpetual motion machine through stimulus, let's face it, it would have been done before. Forgive me, I've got a British background. I did history at school, and the Tudors and Stuarts, they did the same thing. They had silver coins, and what they used to do when things got tight was they used to file off bits of the silver, and so the silver in the sixpenny coin or whatever was slightly less. And you effectively devalued the currency, but nobody really noticed. And then, of course, you got payback. So it's all happening, as people say, human nature is the same. The mechanism by which it changes is different, but which it applies is different. But essentially, in a tight spot, rulers have always tried to do the simple solution because they don't like the risk of taking the world solution. Now, tackling the demographic deficit would have required real courage. Let's pass it on.
Right. Okay, so before we get into going forward, there's a couple other points. So we mentioned China, but I think you talk about China being the other sort of huge dividend that's been now paid through. So talk a little bit about that over the last 30, 40 years.
So China, on the one hand, has been the most fantastic story. They've removed more people from absolute poverty than any other country in history. So it seems to be fantastic. If you're looking at people earning $2 or less per day, in real terms, you've now eliminated that when it was sort of 30 or 40% of the population and so on. But what people forget, I first went to China 30 years ago. So I remember China being on bicycles and so on. And they were still on bicycles in 2001 when they joined World Trade Organization. Today, what happens is you fly in to Shanghai or Beijing, you get on the fast bullet train, and you fly in, you see all these hotels, you say, oh, this is a wonderful country, isn't it? It's very middle class. Well, middle class, the actual disposable household income, annual average, is around $9,000 a year. It's the average. It's less. It's about 5,000 in the rural areas, which is still about 40% of the population. So in other words, what you've done is exactly the same as with subprime, which is for a temporary period, you've convinced people that they are wealthier than they are by allowing them to get property price appreciation. And with that, they go and buy new cars and do all the things that people did in the States and in Europe at the same time. But it has the same end. And that's the problem. And the other problem for China is not only, of course, it's got a communist regime, which makes it very difficult for alternative views to get hold. They're now, if you have an alternative view, even on a messaging service or something, you're liable to lose your job. So this is a police state. It's not a liberal democracy by any means. And what you've got is this phenomenon now of lying flat, as they call it, where people just say, well, look, there's nothing we can do here. So you've got an economy which is in a real mess. You've got a property market which is imploding. And property was 29% of GDP. It was a small third of GDP. So it's imploding. And the solution to China's problem is very simple. People like Professor Michael Pettis and so on have come up with this very constantly and so on. You need to increase consumption because consumption in China is about half the level of the States in terms of GDP, 37% of GDP compared to around 70% in the States. So all you have to do, all inverted commas, is to increase the levels of consumption. But of course, that's a zero-sum game. If I take out 30% of GDP from production and give it to consumption, a lot of people are going to get very upset. All the people who've done well up till now, out of property speculation, all the stuff that goes on, and manufacturing, so it doesn't happen.
Yeah. So the idea that Xi has, right? And I wrote a piece about this saying that we didn't really take Xi seriously as a Marxist and that he's a materialist, production-oriented person, right? That's his view of the world. So essentially, he's trying to make up the infrastructure and particularly housing part of the economy and shift it into high-end advanced manufacturing, right, for export. And so they're just shifting the subsidies, right? And it seems to me like you're just going to try to jam this stuff down everybody's throat, right? We're seeing that in, of course, the US with the rise of Trump and in Europe. So it's almost like now the strategy is I'm going to continue to blow up goods supply in a world where there's no demand. And that just strikes me as like, this is not going to work out. Like there's no one to buy all this stuff, right? And I think so I wanted to go quickly back. So part of the story over the last 30 years has been, China getting richer, but also producing cheap goods, right? Which also helps these people who are acquiring things buy those things. And now that's coming to an end, right? So in a way, are we going to see a shift going forward where you have a China that's doubling down on goods production? We're actually trying to do it, right? Reshore. But the reality is, what are the perennials going to demand? And like, to the extent that they create any demand at all, it's probably for services, right? It's medical, things like that. So do you see that shifting? Like China doubling down on production at this point seems kind of crazy in the face of like an aging population that doesn't need stuff and will want, they want medical services and things like that, right?
Well, I mean, what we argue with our clients and with investors is that the story is actually very simple. For 30 or 40 years, as you say, Alan, we've been in a world where the demand is for more stuff. You remember Jack Welch, a GE CEO, long time ago. All I need is a supply position in the top 3 in terms of cost. And if you build it, as the baseball movie said, they will come. And for a long time, and I was doing this, running businesses around the world and so on, we didn't actually think about customers. We just said, the IMF has said that growth next year is going to be 3.5%, which is what it always said, more or less. And we know that our products grow at 1 times GDP or 2 times GDP, whatever it was that we were talking about. So that means in order to maintain our position, we have to invest in newer capacity, buy, and so on. And we did it. But now, that party, which was a great party, I mean, my career was built on it, so I'm not arguing against it. It was wonderful. But today, what have you got? You've got massive oversupply. You've got, if you look around you, if you look in oil and gas, OPEC, to try and stabilize the price, has had to shut in 6 million barrels a day. And that's of current production. There's another 4 million barrels that they'd like to produce, but they can't. So that's 10% of world demand is shut in because of lack of demand. And it will get worse because China is now negative in terms of oil demand growth, and so on, which was the biggest one, and so on. So you're exactly right. We now move to services. And so what you're saying is we need to have much more of a technical and commercial approach, as opposed to just, here you are, Alan, you'll like it. Have some more, right? When would you like the next delivery, Gov? You say, what's your real issue here? As you say, is it medical? Is it, in other words, it's supplying solutions. And if people that we deal with, some of them have been very, very successful in pivoting their business over the last 5 or 10 years from supplying stuff and commodities into supplying solutions. And that's where the future is. Now, of course, first time you do it. I mean, take an example of this in the auto area. We can see, if you look at robo-taxis, and I don't mean Elon Musk, because I don't think he's ever going to get that to work. He doesn't seem to be. He's been promising for 10 years. But if you look at Waymo, if you look at Zoox, if you look at some of the Chinese players, it's pretty clear that you're in the early stages of getting robo-taxis to work. And I saw a piece by somebody who had been looking at this business for 8 or 9 years, pretty cynical. And he said, I got into a Waymo robo-taxi in San Francisco, and I liked it. So
I did it too. It's great.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
And you think of a service whose time has come. If you've got a lot of older people and they're living in suburbs, what's the one thing they can't do? They can't drive anymore because, you go out and your wife or your husband says, you didn't see that child, did you, running out? No, I didn't. Well, darling, you shouldn't be driving anymore. It's your partner not saying that. It's your kids saying that, So you're essentially going to be stuck in prison unless you can have, autonomous driving. And of course, this is a great opportunity for people like Uber and Lyft and Bolt and so on, because they have all the data on where the cars are going to be needed. They know that everybody from my neighborhood leaves home at 8 o'clock to go into wherever. They know perfectly well that we go to lunch at so-and-so. We know that, and so on. They've got all that data. So they know where to park those cars. And if you think about, at the moment, the average car in the States is used for an hour a day, 4% of time, right? Because most of it is parked and quite a lot of it is sitting in traffic jams, as we all know. Now, if you move to autonomous vehicles and you move to robo-taxis, let's say that goes to 20%. Journeys become much shorter, but of course, auto demand goes down. So I was having a debate actually this morning with somebody, and they were saying, but you're going to destroy all this business. I said, yes, you are. You are going to destroy all the people who've been involved in cars. Just as when cars came along, you destroyed all the jobs that were in horses and carriages. This is what happens. So you're going to get a completely different structure here.
Yeah. So you're really talking about, if we said it simply, going from selling a commodity to taking that commodity and turning it into a service that provides a solution, right? So in a sense, it's like, I don't own a car. I have a robo-taxi run by a company like Uber or Waymo or whatever. I go from and is there a sense here, it's like the older people are, now it's going to shift to the solutions that those people desire, right? So they want to maintain independence longer. So maybe you go from just or owning a house to a house as a solution. So it provides certain kinds of things that allow you to live more independently and not just a traditional model. Or I don't just book a trip anymore. I have an experience with my grandchildren. That's the kind of thing that you got to start thinking through, is how do you turn things into solutions for the perennial class?
The fascinating thing about it is that the value proposition for older people is very strong, as you just described. It's also very strong for younger people, because younger people are actually more interested in the environment. They're more worried about climate change and so on. And actually, they don't have very much money. And so owning a car, which is the second most expensive thing after owning a house, which is something else they can't afford, not having to buy a car is a great benefit for them. So you're getting this is why I think, we're at an early stage with this. But in 5 years' time, I think this will be sweeping the country.
Yeah. So in a sense, I guess, is this really being driven by demographics, or you think so?
Yeah. I mean, my point is the only form of demand comes from people. So if I'm at a certain age, my demand, there's tons of evidence from this around the world. It's not clever or anything else. It's just common sense. But common sense is perhaps not very common, but it needs to be. At a certain age, I'm thinking about, gosh, that girl looks rather good. I'd rather like to get up with her. Yeah, all right, okay, let's settle down. Let's have some kids. Let's buy a car, and so on and so forth. When I get older, I'm not thinking about having kids anymore. Maybe thinking about having grandkids and so on, things like that. But my ideas and my needs change. That's why demographics actually runs the whole show.
Right. And in a sense, I guess you'd say all right, if there's all this supply, then why can't young people afford cars, right? Because if there is some demand, right? And I guess, I don't know how you would answer that. I guess I would say something like, well, politics also follows demographics, and there are a lot more older voters. So, they want these services. They don't really care about the cars. So we're going to put on 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs so that cars do stay more expensive than they probably should. And, something in that kind of zip code, like.
Yeah, all of these things. I think the issue of tariffs is a very interesting case. And I think it has become very politicized, but I don't think it should be. Because the question on the exam paper today is the states happy to import and be the importer of last resort? Or does the states actually want to have more control over its own supply chains? Lithium. We were working with people 4 or 5 years ago, and they were saying, "Oh, we ought to invest in lithium. There's a massive shortage." We said, "Guys, there's a massive amount of lithium in the world. Massive amount. You can get it out of seawater, you can get it from mining and so on. The only reason it's tight at the moment is you've got a new source of demand, and nobody in the West has bothered because it was all available from China." Well, today, the price of lithium, I haven't looked at it recently yet, but it's fallen about 90%. Most of these things are there. There are some things that are rare, and you could be held hostage to fortune, and so on. I agree with that. But in the main, there's nothing wrong. I think if you're worried about climate change, which a lot of people are, one of the things you don't need is global supply chains. You want to go back to local for local. When I started work in the late 70s, everything I sold on behalf of my company was made in the UK. And nothing really was sold outside. French and German companies who were making the same thing didn't come across the English Channel to do that. We sold. Then globalization began, and then suddenly people began to talk about supply chains. And I went, "What do you mean? What's a supply chain?" They said, "Well,
When do you think that was where that really shifted?
Well, for us, it was in 1985, 1986. I remember we had internal email at the time. When I came to the States, it cost me $100 a month with AT&T to do it, but it was worth it. My Japanese colleagues had fax machines. And for the first time, Tokyo could actually write a fax in Japanese and send it, which you couldn't have done before. So technology changed the way, and we suddenly began to move to 24/7 trading in the oil market and so on. And I remember working with Citibank and others around developing futures contracts and so on. All of this began to happen in that period. And it was all fantastically exciting because some of it worked and some of it didn't. But you moved from distribution to supply chains. But now you don't need this anymore. Look at all the disruption you've got, all the politicization. We don't even talk about what's going on in the Red Sea anymore. We're just used to the fact that it doesn't work and you can't bring ships through there and so on. But why are you doing it? Why aren't you making on the East Coast for the East Coast? Why aren't you making on the West Coast? Why aren't you doing? And that, of course, is what is going to happen.
So some trends here we're seeing, people moving into older demographics across the world, a breakdown of supply chains, but reshoring, and then massive debts, right, across basically every country except maybe Germany. And then, some geopolitical instability kind of mixed in there, right? And you talked about the United States defaulting before, and I guess, on its debt, and that's sort of, I guess when we went off the gold standard in the late 60s or early 70s when Nixon took us off the gold standard, that was in effect a default, right? Because before that, you could exchange your, dollars for gold. Now you can't. So in a sense, that's a default, right? But most people didn't really view it that way at the time. So going forward, what do you see? Are we moving into, because I hear inflation and deflation at the same time, right? I hear inflation in the sense of reshoring supply chains. They're not quite as efficient. I hear, maybe breakdown in some commodity supply chains, that kind of stuff. But I also hear, hey, abundant supply, aging demographics, so they don't buy as much or they buy differently. I'm using that car 80% of the time rather than 4% or whatever it is. So kind of give us an idea of how you're seeing that future play out.
Right. You see, you're exactly right, Alan. What we're talking about now is moving away from what one might call a one-size-fits-all mentality. in the past, I've done this. I'm not, whatever. When I began to invest, my broker suggested a Japanese ETF. And I said, okay, because how did I know about Japan? I didn't, but the ETF had it. That's all I wanted. He advised me to get exposure to Japan, and it all worked out very well. This was in the 80s. Hasn't worked out so well since until recently. There's a time for everything. And so, gradually you've moved into a world which is, much easier from an investment point of view. You've got momentum. That you've got all these technicals that people, when we were doing technicals in the 80s, that was pretty exciting. You really get a much. Well, everybody can do technicals today.
Now you just buy MTUM, right?
Yeah, people, you just go on and X or whatever, or B Sky, and there you are. It's all free for you. And you've got any ETF that you want to have, and so on and so forth. But I was talking to an investor this morning, and we were agreeing that exactly what you're talking about is now underway. And this year, we'll see a return to stock picking. You may well be a stock picking by, you choose an ETF and so on, because nothing wrong with that. But the idea that you simply put your money in and it automatically goes up. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the market, you're now suddenly getting a lot of volatility. Because Trump has said, nobody effing knows what I'm doing. Least of all me. He said that publicly to the Wall Street Journal, for goodness sake. In his pre-election interim, he said, well, Xi Jinping, won't he make Taiwan because he knows I'm crazy? Well, that may or may not be true, self-description. But what it means is, investment normally, if I'm a company or I'm an investor, is about certainty. I like consistency. I like to know that this is all going to be happening in 5 years' time or 2 years' time or whatever my time horizon is. But it can change morning to night. If we suddenly, get personal from them, the UK is supposed to have this special relationship with the United States. It's supposed to be the bedrock of everything. And then yesterday, you get Elon Musk, who I understand is quite senior in the government and not elected, saying, well, I think we should invade the UK to get rid of the tyrannical Keir Starmer. I mean, I know Keir Starmer. He lived really close to where I was in London. I mean, there's many things you can say about Keir Starmer, but tyrant, I think is pretty far away from what most people would expect. But there is potentially, one of the top people in the administration, and maybe Trump shares this, maybe he doesn't, I don't know. But goodness me, there is no consistency. So if you're going to invest, you better be able to deal with this. Because saying, oh, I'm sure he doesn't mean it. Well, you might be right, but then again, you might not be.
He doesn't like Nigel Farage either. I don't care who he likes, but...
Buddy, here's our picture in front of Trump. This week, it's a guy who, and this is the irony, that this is the guy who was jailed for illegally trying to enter the States. The UK jailed him for that. So why are you as an American saying you ought to be released? It was your blooming laws.
Well, okay, so volatility, uncertainty, right? So how does the debt thing play out? So, a lot of us, I follow Russell Napier quite a bit. I don't know if you know him, Library of Mistakes.
Right, I know Russell well, yeah.
Yeah, so he thinks we're inevitably going into this period of like the soft default, like financial repression, where we force financial institutions and others to buy bonds, treasury bonds, and even Stephen Mirren, who was just appointed to the head of the National Economic Council, I believe it is, in the Trump administration, he's written papers about forcing our allies to buy treasuries in exchange for U.S. military protection and free trade access. So, which strikes me as probably unworkable, given that everybody needs to reinvest in their economies. But how do you see that, like the debt side of this playing out? Because if you remove that stimulus, first of all, like I look at this Doge stuff, and I'm like, all the expansion in federal debt is to entitlements, most of those to older people. And we're not going to cut that. We're engaged in tax cuts for some unknown reason. We don't need them. They're actually negative to growth at this point, given how low they already are. So like, how is this all going to play out, do you think? And how does an investor deal with it?
Well, I mean, what we're doing with our clients is we're exactly picking up your points about confusion and complexity and so on. And we're running scenario planning workshops because I don't believe that there is a clear way forward on this. And what we're saying is in the past, as I say, we're always going back about when you're forecasting demand. You say GDP is going to be 3.5%, and our product grows at 1 times GDP. Well, actually, we're having a budget discussion and a strategy discussion. I think it's going to be a bit better next year. I think it might be 1.05. Oh, no, say you. No, I think it might I think we had some because I think it might be 0.9. In other words, the bang between best and worst was very narrow. It was real. But that's where today you have to have a scenario that says actually there will be a default on the debt. Right? You also have to have a scenario that says you will raise taxes, you will change the dynamics here. You could, we've put forward over the past to policymakers and so on, they take no notice, but that's by the way, if you changed the retirement age from 60-ish sort of thing up to 70-ish, well, suddenly older people would be back in the workforce. They would be producing supply and demand. Now, these are always to be very unfair in works. But, if you've actually got an extra 10 or 15 years of active life, what we say is, and sorry, let me just go back in history for a moment. You go back 200 years or so, and you had the first smallpox injection and vaccination. And at that time, around a third of the population in the Western world and elsewhere died of smallpox. And this came in thanks to a country doctor.
That's crazy. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And people were very disfigured if they got it and survived. 1796, this was discovered and it spread marvelously. And so within 10 or 15 years, suddenly, life expectancy, which had been around 35, for as long as you can go back in history, by 1900, had moved up to 50. And what you did was you moved from you were born, you worked, you died, you moved to you're born, you work, and you are educated. And then you worked some more. So you were working with your family. And so you moved again from, as this life expectancy increased, you went from being born, from being educated to working. And by 1900, Bismarck in Germany and Lloyd George in the UK were introducing pensions. Now, we think pension is pretty normal. It's only been around 100, 150 years. Right? And it was for a very small number of people. In the UK, when it came in 1908, it was 400,000 people out of 43 million. Very few people lived that long, even then. But now, the average person is going to die sometime around the 80s. So you need to move to, you're born, you're educated, you work, you get bored, you change your life, you retrain to do something else. If you're a manual worker, you don't do manual work anymore. You probably can't do it, but you do something else that you're interested in. If you're a blue collar, if you're a white collar worker, you may be bored working in the office or whatever, but you may well want to do something else. And it may be caring, that may be artistic work, it may be whatever. But get people back in the workforce, and that has an impact on them because suddenly you reduce mental illness, you reduce general illness. They're not sitting on the couch watching daytime TV and so on. So you have a double benefit. Now, I agree that is quite difficult to sell to people. The first reaction, you're taking my retirement away. Yeah, okay, fine. But let's just sit back. The alternative. So all I'm saying is, if you're talking to people, if you're planning, there is a scenario that you could get out of this. There's a scenario where you could make it absolute disaster. Now, maybe you end up in the middle, but you have to be aware of if we might be moving towards a more sensible approach, how would you know that? If we might be moving towards a stupider approach, how would you know that? And that's the skill. And getting your timing right is also very important. It's no good saying, well, this might happen in 10 years' time. I was an oil trader, and the oil trading, like most of life, is the question, why? It's a very interesting question, but probably not totally relevant to making money. What's going on, and when? And when is when you make money or not? And as you know, oil traders get it right 57% of the time because the outcomes are pretty binary. You can be right for the right reasons. That's me. Sometimes.
Yeah, I like the framework. And I think, I'm supposed to be interviewing you, and I'm hiding myself, but I sort of had this sense, like, if you look, just look at like the French parliament right now. So The only majority on the table for anything in that parliament is to reduce the retirement age from 62 to 60, to take away Macron's minor fix, right, that now everyone hates him for. And so I kind of go back to the Russell Napier thing where I agree with, the scenarios, but it strikes me that the crisis has to come before the sensible solution is adopted. And it's very similar, to like what we see playing out in Argentina right now. We see so much support from Milei from the incoming, I guess, the tech bros sort of start half of the Republican Party. I just don't see them as being able to implement this they did not get a majority for that, right? And we're going to have to get to something where the 10-year bond is not 4.6 or whatever it is today. It's going to have to be 6 or higher for anyone to give the pain to say you're going to have to retire 3 years later.
Well, I mean, you've got Russell, you've got Albert Edwards and his deep freeze concept and so on. There are a range of options. I'm exactly saying all of these have their supporters and all of these have their plus points and so on, but we just don't know. I think if we talked to Russell, he would agree. His library of mistakes up in Edinburgh, if you want a mistake, he can show you it.
So one is the scenario planning. I think also what fits into that is it strikes me that the stimulus, or at least levels of stimulus, doesn't stop anytime soon. So I don't know how you see that. So let me play out this scenario. Basically, base level stimulus continues as long as it's possible to do it, right, within the Western world. And that moves into the Fed, at some point monetizing the debt and buying bonds so that we can continue to pump them. Maybe we're not doing 6-7% deficits. Maybe it's more like 4, but we're going to do what we need to do to keep things going. So you don't really get a big recession. Might get slowdowns here and there, but things kind of. But what you're really worried about now is because we're deglobalizing is really supply shocks, and so you have a lot of temporary spikes in whether it be oil. I mean, depending where you are in the world, what you need, right? So how do you see that? It's like, do you see that governments are going to be able to continue to keep the monetary pipeline flowing, or you're saying that that's done? Like the debt level is too high at this point.
Well, as you understand, I can't argue against what you're saying. I regard it as being certainly within the level of probabilities. I would give it about a 20% possibility at the moment. I think the most likely, this is a personal view, is that we are seeing the return of the bond vigilantes. And there are a lot of people who've lent money to the US government. There are a lot of people who've lent money to companies. I mean, I think the figure, I haven't checked it recently, about 40% of the Russell 2000 companies don't make any money.
Yeah, they're zombies.
Yeah, they're zombies, And, and I can understand if you're a new company, that obviously you're not making any money. But if you're doing this and your future has been on the ground as well, you can always refinance because the Fed is always keeping interest rates at 0 and there's always lots of printed money. Well, if that changes, which is what's happening at the moment, those companies go bust. So the Albert Edwards scenario of a deep freeze seems to be something that, to me, to be something that one has to think about. And if I'm a lender, I think there is a real possibility that we transition away from the fixation with return on capital, and we go back to where we were when I was younger, which is return of capital. If you go back to the old bank manager was someone who went to high school, ended up with a high school qualification, didn't go to university, belonged to the golf club, belonged to the round table, knew everyone, knew Alan, you'll always pay back. I'll happily lend to him. Paul, you're joking. And we moved away from that personal approach. My bank manager used to take me out to lunch. This was one of his functions in life. I was pretty cool, so I quite liked a free lunch. But it was, that was the way that it worked. And he was gaining information and insight all the time. Now you move to credit scoring. And if you talk to the credit scoring people today and I want to borrow something, they don't even know I have the account with them. It's not relevant to them. So it's all, but you will move back to that. And what I'm saying is, I think you will see, I believe, and I think this is what we're seeing since September. But if the Fed can do what it's like, it can take interest rates down if it wants to 1%. But every time it moves it down, the bond market vigilantes will tend to do the equal and opposite move. What they're doing at the moment, and it's quite striking.
Well, let's play that out. I want to come back to that. So that means some kind of adjustment to the budget deficit, right? And that would mean, large scale unemployment, some kind of major recession where you'd see a lot of these zombies go out of business. And then you'd be reallocating capital into, you'd say, all right, well, things are reshoring. And so eventually after that, you'd see like a shift to like value stocks, right? Probably like traditional kind of sectors where that's sort of the play out, like a recession, a lot of unemployment, readjustment back to these more cash flow oriented value type companies.
That's why I'm putting forward a more positive approach to this, because I'm not particularly in favor of, quarter or whatever of the population become unemployed and going back to the Depression. I really don't think that's a very sensible thing to do. And I think the policymakers ought to be a bit more intelligent, frankly. And there is a perfectly viable solution, which I put forward, which is around you have to have a difficult conversation with people about retraining and about raising the pension age. You have to put funds into those retraining exercises, because if you want to go and do something else apart from being a brilliant interviewer, you need some retraining to do it. So you've got to be prepared to invest to do that, and you've got to be prepared to ride investors. Oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to back them, and so on and so forth. But you do risk, and this is my fundamental point. If you don't do something like what I'm suggesting, you are going to have civil war.
Okay, so explain that. Why is it going to be civil war?
Well, because if you're going to close, you've got 40% of Russell 2000 companies who can't pay their interest bill anymore out of earnings, and they go bust, that's unemployment. And our people, we have been there before in the 30s. It's been chronicled what happened and so on, and the climate changed a bit, and that didn't help either. But do we want to go back to that? And will people be so passive this time?
I don't think so. I agree with you on that. So here's the scenario I see playing out. Not that I favor it in the sense of like it's better policy, but that's what I think they're going to do. So my guess is, yes, bond yields spike. They have difficulty. They're going to have to do some kind of tax cut. It's not going to be as big as I think. And they're going to have to keep pumping money in to some extent. So then the Fed just starts stuffing treasuries into every financial institution it can find and buying all the 10 years to bring the rate down, financial repression, right? And then we see an allocation of capital. The government gets heavily involved in the allocation of capital through additional, whether, maybe it's Republicans, it's more tax incentives, with Democrats, it might be more direct, grants like we're seeing with the CHIPS Act. And so basically the government starts allocating capital, or at least reducing the cost of capital for people who are going to invest in reshoring and things like that. And I wouldn't want to be like the private equity firm trying to roll up veterinary hospitals at that point, right? Because I'm not going to get cheap capital. So I see that playing out over a couple of decades. And that's the way they can artificially repress the long-term bond rates and then get the investment they want, harness sort of this national capitalism. I'm just mimicking Russell, right? So that is one scenario, Paul. And then I'm trying to get the contrast. I think you're saying we need to do the tax increase, slow the growth in the entitlements, and invest to kind of get through to a more sustainable thing. But we're not going to sit here and manipulate all the interest rates. We're going to do that by being more conservative. And then we're going to use some amount of money to cushion the 25% unemployment and bring it down to 8% or whatever it's going to be. Am I characterizing that right?
You're absolutely right to present the alternatives, because what you're saying is that's the primrose path to dalliance, as people say, is what Ronald Reagan would describe as the most frightening words in the dictionary. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And we've already had central banks playing the role of the central banks in Russia, the Soviet Union, and allocating money and so on, and producing left boots in Slovakia and right boots in Ukraine, and hoping that they might meet up in Berlin or whatever, or not, as the case may be. But that's what we lived through in the Soviet side of the Cold War, and it didn't work very well. And I don't think it would work very well in the West, but it is the default position. because it involves you doing nothing. You just let it slide and, oh, yes, once we don't agree with it, but of course we'll have it, and so on and so on. My alternative requires you to actually have the balls to say, guys, this is where we're going if we don't do something. We should have done it in 1999, 2000, when we had the balanced budget. We didn't have a deficit. And instead, we did the stupid war in Iraq. And then we did the stupid subprime thing. And then we, so on and so forth. Every time, if there's a more stupid option, that's what we've done.
My point exactly, Paul.
Yeah.
So I think we're going down this road. Now, I think the U.S. has a lot more leeway to do this than other countries do, right? So I think China, to your point, China's at 400% debt to GDP if you take everything in account. They're just at the end of the road. I don't know how that's going to work.
All you have to do is to look at the Asian currencies, and they are uniformly either at all-time lows against the dollar or pretty close to it.
Yeah. And so the U.S. is at 255 or something like that with private sector. We've got more, more financialized economy. We've got more leeway. So I see us pursuing the Russell path. And to be honest, didn't we do forms of this in the 50s and 60s? We were directing capital, right? I mean, subtly through different, wasn't from the Politburo necessarily, but, and if it doesn't work out, we hit crisis and then we go to a more draconian version of what you're saying. But that's kind of how I see, because if we did if we just right now said, we're not going to renew these Trump tax cuts, and we're going to raise the retirement age and Medicare and Social Security gradually to 70, protecting everybody 50 and over the next, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. I don't know the exact figures. Basically, the whole thing is fine, right? I think that's all it takes, but we're not going to do that. We're going to keep going the way we are. We're going to cut taxes, and then the government's going to get into financial repression and allocating capital. And then eventually there'll be a crisis, maybe. I don't know. And then we would go to your solution, I think. But I think it's very important to recognize that those are the default option is probably more and more government involvement.
Well, you see, where I disagree with you, Alan, and I'm not disagreeing, I'm not saying you're wrong, is the thing that the central bank did with support from governments was to take away the market's key role of price discovery. Now, what I would suggest to you, very humbly, is that the market is now taking that role back again. And once the genie is out of the lamp, I don't think they can get it back in again. I think people are now I think investors are starting to say, I'm sorry, I'm quite happy to lend to Alan. I think he's fine, but I'm not lending to Paul. No, I don't care what you offer me. I won't do it. If that's 40% of your Russell 2000, or say it's 30%, but the other 10% are new, well, that's the economy. And Trump doesn't help this. Trump is so unpredictable that you cannot take a view. If you go back to Reagan, you might or might not agree with what he was doing, but you were sure that the people around him, Jim and so on, they were pretty consistent. You knew where you were. And so for the next 4 years, and probably the 4 years after that, this is how it is. You look at what happened yesterday with Trump. Washington Post saying, they're actually not going to be tariffs on everything, and then Trump coming and says they are. Both were true at a particular moment. He changed his mind.
Starting his cat, right? So I do think you make a really good point there, though, because you talk about that Russell 3000, whatever it is, and you say, hey, 40% of these aren't making money. And in my scenario, they're probably not the companies that are going to get the favored capital treatment because they're doing all sorts of other things in the old, the economy is zero interest rates, right? So inevitably, they're not going to get the money. And so they're going to go out of business at some point, right?
But then if they're not for Elon Musk, then they don't get the money, do they?
Right. So there is some amount of, even with stimulus, even with all the things we're saying, there's going to be an adjustment here that could get pretty ugly. And so your point is that's coming now.
Yeah.
So you think investors, we're sitting here talking about year 3 of the S&P being over 20% growth, right? So you're saying not happening?
Well, I mean, all you have to do, is one knows that momentum is very key. And things carry on much longer than you expected. You're talking to a former oil trader. I'm used to having a theory that says this is where the oil price should be, and I can discuss it with some of the leading oil traders in the world, because I'm in that kind of position, we can all agree that that's where the market should be. But we're also traders, and we're going to do the opposite because that's the way of making money. So I absolutely understand why we are in this mess today. But the idea that NVIDIA should be, in the position it is, when we're nowhere near artificial intelligence. You've only got to read any of the scientific papers. It's complete nonsense, right? And we've been here before with NVIDIA. If you look at the charts, we talked about technicals and so on, anybody can do this. All you have to do is to compare Cisco in the run-up to the dot-com debacle, which was exactly the same. It's absolutely core. The dot-com people will always be needing real servers and all of this sort of stuff, and NVIDIA will always be needing and so on. You look at the path of the share prices, exactly the same. And history doesn't change.
All right, so I have an investment idea that I was going to pitch in a newsletter feature. I was like, someone should start maybe in the next 6 months raising money for a distressed data center fund. Because I feel like it's going to be like the global crossing. And I think you're starting, Microsoft saying 80 billion in the data centers this year, regularly, something like that. And, you're already starting to see the cracks in some of and they're just not going to be able to hit these revenue targets. And you see Microsoft trying to stuff Copilot charges onto their customers now. So people aren't coming to it. They're being forced into it or tricked into it. So it does feel like...
I don't know whether you follow Fred Hickey, but I've been following Fred for donkey's years, and he's absolutely summing up where we are. And we are at the end of the game.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it probably goes on for a year, but at some point, one earnings quarter where growth goes from 300 to 10.
Let's get down to basic. Look at Apple, right? Second most important market is China, and China foreign sales of smartphones, which is basically Apple, were down 46% because trade wars mean, and so you look at, and when did I bought a new iPad because the other one went bust. Right? It's the latest technology for an iPad came out in 22, 3 years ago. There's nothing new at all. And it sounds...
Well, they made the transition to services, right?
And that's okay. But, look at their fast with the BBC. They said, we'll do AI editing of your headlines. For the first week, the BBC said, actually, I think we might reconsider this one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think, so what I'm taking overall from this is, look, the world is changing. We have these demographic trends. We have the reshoring, breakdown in globalization. And so what you're really saying is we need to go from this, maybe, in a way, a much more predictable world. So now we just got to go into the scenario planning mode. The variation between outcomes, and it can swing back and forth. And there is no way to say this is what's going to happen. So that's the basic general message is we got to get back to, we got to look. And I love your way of saying it. It's we could have complete trade war or none, right? And everywhere in between. And we have no idea which one it is.
And when I started as a commercial graduate and a sales rep, and I was dealing with the paint and resin industry in southeastern England. And ICI, which is the company I worked for, was the largest company in the UK, second largest chemical company in the world. And I would go and visit my customers. And what people wanted from me, we negotiated prices, but they wanted to know what the ICI was thinking about the Soviet Union. What was the ICI thinking about the oil price? What was the ICI thinking about the US economy? Right? This was very valuable information for them. And that's where we're going back to today. There isn't a agreed view. You've got to make an assessment. You listen to somebody who's repeating what he's been told by the experts in ICI. You listen to the experts that you hear and so on. And you go, I think I believe that. But there's no certainty. I like it, I like that.
Yeah. I guess in a way, there was uncertainty before, but you had these trends of interest rates going down, demographics going up. And so in a certain sense in this world, there still are these trends, right? The trends are older people, older populations. And I think we will probably move back into a more predictable environment at some point once we kind of understand where these things are going to play out. But as you point out, there's a high variance band of what direction we take to Like we just said, hey, we could go off and probably, like, the solution to the US budget crisis is very simple, but it's not easy at all to do, right? And so there's a possibility we do that. But then there's the possibility that I lay out with sort of like Russell's view, where we just keep doing the bad stuff until we hit a crisis. And we don't know where we're going to land in between those poles, right? Yeah, it's fascinating. So, Paul, this has been fantastic. I feel like I learned a ton out of this. If people want to reach out, get the PH report, see what your services are, where do they go?
Very simple, new-normal.com.
Excellent. And reach out to Paul and his team. They do, how often do you do the report? Is it yearly? Or?
Well, no, we do a monthly report, and we do specific projects. We're doing a lot of, as you can understand, a lot of our clients are in the financial area and in corporates, and we're doing a lot of scenario planning workshops for people. Not because we know what the scenario is going to be, but just because we can say, look, you need to think about this, as you say, the Russell Napier view, the Albert Edwards view. We can put all these together. The benefit of our position is we're independent. So we're not trying to push a particular line to get a commission. We're just saying, look, these are the options, and we're prepared to argue the case until you think about it and decide what you want to do yourself.
I like the business. So it's like basically a base subscription to like a monthly kind of report updating you on what's going on in these issues. And then you can buy consulting services to kind of get your specific company.
Exactly.
Excellent. Well, Paul, again, thank you. This is fantastic. Definitely everybody check out Paul's work and the PH report, and appreciate you being on.
That's really good. Look forward to you coming back again. I'll be there.
Of course, we will have you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The New Rules with Alan Pentz. For more insights on mastering the new game, follow at @Pentz, that's APENTZ, on X, and make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, in today's world, you don't follow the rules, you write them.